Before the first helicopter touched down in the Ia Drang Valley, Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore gathered his battalion and made them a promise. He stood in front of 450 men who were about to fly into a landing zone that had not been scouted, in a valley nobody had yet fought in, against an enemy whose size and disposition were unknown, and he told them three things. He would be the first man off the first helicopter. He would be the last man to leave the field, and he would leave nobody behind. Dead or alive, no American would remain in that valley when it was over. Every man standing in front of him would come home. 3 days later, as 234 of those men lay dead or wounded, and the North Vietnamese army was pressing its attacks in waves, a message arrived from the commanding general of all American forces in Vietnam. General William Westmoreland was ordering Moore to leave the battlefield immediately, board a helicopter, fly to Saigon, and brief the general staff on what was happening. The battle was not finished. Men were still dying. Moore had not yet brought everyone home, and his supreme commander was ordering him to go. Moore sent his regrets. He stayed. This is the story of the battle that opened the ground war in Vietnam. The promise a commander kept against a direct order from a 4-star general, and the way the men who won that battle were betrayed, not by the enemy, but by the system that processed their victory into a strategy that would eventually kill 58,000 Americans and lose the war anyway. In the fall of 1965, the United States military had been escalating its involvement in Vietnam for months. The first major American ground combat units had arrived. General Westmoreland had been given command of Military Assistance Command Vietnam and had developed a strategy he called Search and Destroy. Find North Vietnamese and Viet Cong units, fix them in place, and kill them faster than they could be replaced. The metric that would drive everything that followed was the body count. How many enemy dead? The theory was that there was a crossover point, a number at which North Vietnamese losses would exceed their ability to recruit and train replacements. Reach that number, and the enemy's will to fight would break. The problem with this theory was that it was never true, and the Battle of Ia Drang was the moment that should have proven it, and didn't, because the men who read the numbers chose to see only what the strategy needed them to see. Harold Gregory Moore Jr. was born on February 13, 1922, in Bardstown, Kentucky. He came from a military family. His father had served in the First World War, and he pursued the academy with the focused determination that would characterize everything he did afterward. He graduated from West Point in 1945, too late for the Second World War, but in time for Korea, where he served with the 7th Infantry Regiment in some of the hardest fighting of that conflict. He came out of Korea with a deep and specific understanding of what happened to infantry soldiers when their officers made bad decisions, and an equally deep conviction about what the relationship between a commander and his men was supposed to look like. Moore was not a political general. He was not interested in career advancement for its own sake. He was interested in tactics, in training, in the mechanics of keeping soldiers alive while accomplishing the mission. He read everything. He studied every battle he could access documentation on. He was particularly focused on the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, where a conventional army had been surrounded and destroyed by a light infantry force willing to accept casualties the French were not. He read the French after-action reports. He read the assessments. He understood what had gone wrong. And he understood that the army he was now preparing to take to Vietnam was going to face a version of the same enemy in the same terrain, and that the outcome would depend almost entirely on preparation and leadership at the small unit level. When he took command of the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, the 1st 7th Cav, at Fort Benning in the summer of 1965, he inherited a unit that was transitioning to the Army's new air assault concept. The idea was to use helicopters the way earlier armies had used horses, to move infantry rapidly across terrain that would have been impassable on foot, to strike where the enemy did not expect, to create a kind of three-dimensional mobility that conventional forces could not match. The 1st Air Cavalry Division was the experimental realization of this concept, and Moore's battalion was part of it. They trained hard, they trained constantly. Moore ran exercises that replicated the specific conditions they expected in Vietnam: dense vegetation, broken terrain, an enemy that did not fight from fixed positions but moved, dispersed, and massed at will. He also had a conversation with his men before they deployed. The promise he made was not ceremonial. It was not the kind of speech a commander gives to boost morale before a difficult mission. It was a contract. He was telling them, explicitly, that he would not do what officers at higher levels sometimes did: protect their careers at the expense of their men, file optimistic reports, declare objectives secured before they were secure, or leave the field while the fighting continued. He was telling them the one thing soldiers most need to know: that the man in command is going to stay until it is done. They flew into Vietnam in September of 1965. By October, the 1st Air Cav was operating in the Central Highlands, the mountainous spine of South Vietnam where the borders of Laos and Cambodia created a sanctuary that North Vietnamese forces used to move troops and supplies into the south. The Ia Drang Valley in Pleiku Province was a known staging area for North Vietnamese army units. American intelligence knew NVA regiments were operating in the valley. What they did not know, what would not become clear until Moore's battalion was already on the ground, was that those regiments included the 66th and 33rd NVA regiments along with elements of the 9th Mortar Battalion, comprising approximately 2,000 men. Moore would be landing with approximately 450. Type the number 5 in the comments right now if you're still watching. It helps this channel more than you know. On November 14th, 1965, at 10:48 in the morning, the first helicopters descended into landing zone X-ray, a clearing at the base of the Chupong Massif. Moore was on the lead ship. His boots were the first American boots on the ground. The clearing was roughly the size of a football field. Around it, on 3 sides, jungle. Above it, the rising slopes of the Chupong, where the North Vietnamese had their base camps and staging areas. Moore had chosen the landing zone partly because it was large enough to receive helicopters, and partly because it was close to where intelligence suggested the enemy was concentrated. He was not trying to avoid the NVA, he was trying to find them. He found them immediately. Within minutes of the first lift landing, a patrol encountered the enemy less than 200 meters from the landing zone. Within the hour, the NVA was attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. Moore's companies were still arriving. The helicopters could only carry a portion of the battalion at a time, and the cycle of insertion, return to the staging area, loading, and return to the landing zone meant that for the first several hours, Moore was defending a shrinking perimeter with an incomplete force against an enemy that had the advantage of numbers, terrain knowledge, and interior lines. The NVA had been training for years to fight exactly this kind of battle. They had studied American tactics. They knew that the way to defeat air assault units was to get close enough that American artillery and air support became as dangerous to the Americans as to the NVA. Their doctrine was described by one of their commanders as grabbing the Americans by the belt buckle. Stay inside the range at which American firepower could be used, and fight with rifles and grenades and human will. Captain John Herron's Bravo Company was hit first. Herron's men pushed into the jungle toward the initial contact and walked into a prepared NVA position. Within minutes, his lead platoon was cut off. Lieutenant Henry Herrick led the platoon into a draw and found himself surrounded on all sides. His radio operator, Specialist 4 Wilbur Curry, was killed. Sergeant James Vickers was killed. The platoon was taking fire from 3 directions. Herrick himself was shot and killed before he could complete a radio call to Herron. Sergeant Ernie Savage took command of the 28 surviving men and did what the training said. He set up a perimeter, called in his position, and held. For the next 30 hours, what became known as the Lost Platoon fought in place, calling in artillery that fell close enough to throw dirt on the American wounded, keeping the NVA at bay through darkness and through the following day, until the fighting elsewhere allowed a relief force to reach them. Of the 29 men in that platoon, 8 were killed and 12 wounded. None was captured. Meanwhile, on the main perimeter, the situation was deteriorating toward catastrophe. Charlie Company, under Captain Bob Edwards, held the southern portion of the perimeter. In the early afternoon, the NVA hit Charlie in a massed frontal assault, dozens of soldiers running upright through the grass in the full knowledge that they would take casualties, pressing forward, accepting losses, trying to overrun the American line through sheer weight of bodies. Edwards was wounded. His radio operator was killed beside him. The company's perimeter contracted. At one point, the NVA were within the landing zone itself, close enough that Moore could see them from his command post at the base of a termite mound he had designated as his headquarters. He was calling artillery strikes to within 25 meters of American positions. His forward air controller, Captain Matt Dillon, was coordinating strikes from fighters that came in so low their jet wash flattened the grass around the Americans. Moore was everywhere. He moved constantly around the perimeter, not to show courage for its own sake, but because the situation was changing faster than radio reports could convey it. He needed to see with his own eyes. He needed to make decisions in seconds that would determine whether specific positions held. Sergeant Major Basil Plumley, his command sergeant major, walked beside him through the fire with the absolute composure of a man who had been in this situation before and had decided somewhere along the way that a bullet would find him when it was ready and not before. Plumley later became famous for telling soldiers throwing themselves flat on the ground, "Sergeant, if you have time to dig, you have time to fight." The battle did not go quiet at night. The NVA pressed all through the darkness of November 14th into the 15th, probing for weak points, running small assaults to keep the Americans from sleeping, trying to find a gap in the perimeter. Medevac helicopters came in under fire to pull out the most seriously wounded. Every pilot who flew into X-ray that night knew they were entering a landing zone under active fire. Every one of them came anyway. The aircraft took hits. Some were damaged enough to require immediate replacement. The pilots flew the missions. By the morning of November 15th, Moore had the full battalion on the ground and had been reinforced by Alpha Company of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry. The NVA attacks continued throughout the day. Massed assaults, snipers, mortars, the relentless pressure of an enemy that had committed to this battle and could not disengage without accepting a defeat it would not accept. Moore called in B-52 arc light strikes on the Chupong Massif, the first use of strategic bombers in direct support of a ground engagement in Vietnam. The explosions were audible and visible from X-ray, a sound like distant thunder that went on for longer than thunder has any right to. American air support was now essentially continuous. Fighter bombers cycled in from carriers and air bases, expending ordnance on NVA positions that intelligence was identifying in real time from the patterns of the attacks. It was during this period, while the battle was still ongoing, while Moore was still moving around his perimeter and making decisions that were keeping men alive, that the message arrived from Westmoreland's headquarters. The commanding general wanted Moore in Saigon. His staff needed a briefing on the fighting at X-ray. Moore was to board a helicopter and report to Military Assistance Command Vietnam immediately. Moore's reaction, by his own account and by accounts from the officers around him, was something between disbelief and controlled fury. He was being ordered to leave his battalion while it was in contact with the enemy. He was being ordered to break the promise he had made to 450 men, the promise that he would be the last to leave. He was being ordered to fly to Saigon to brief a staff that was not in danger, had not been in danger, and whose need for information was not remotely comparable in urgency to the need of the men at X-ray for competent command. He sent his regrets. He told his headquarters he was unable to comply. He stayed at X-ray. This was not a minor act of disobedience. Westmoreland was not a colonel. He was a 4-star general, the commanding general of American forces in Vietnam, the most powerful officer in the theater. Refusing a direct order from a 4-star general in a combat zone was the kind of thing that ended careers. Moore knew this. He refused anyway. He stayed with his men. The battle at X-ray ended on November 16th when Moore's battalion was extracted and replaced by the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry and the 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry. As the last helicopter lifted off, Moore's boots were among the last to leave the ground. He had kept the promise. Every American from his battalion who died at X-ray came home. The dead came home. The wounded came home. Not one man was left in the Ia Drang Valley. The casualty figures from X-ray were staggering and were immediately used by Westmoreland's headquarters in a way that tells you everything you need to know about the strategy Moore had just risked his career to serve. American dead at X-ray, 79. American wounded, 121. Estimated NVA dead, approximately 634, with many more wounded. The kill ratio, the metric that Westmoreland's search and destroy strategy was built on, was better than 8-1 in favor of the Americans. In the broader Ia Drang campaign, including the catastrophic engagement at Landing Zone Albany 2 days later, approximately 305 Americans were killed and over 500 wounded against estimated NVA casualties that ran to several times that number. Westmoreland looked at those numbers and saw confirmation. His strategy was working. The crossover point was achievable. The enemy was taking losses he could not sustain. In his report to Washington, he called Ia Drang a decisive victory. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara flew to Saigon in November and left convinced that the numbers supported continued escalation. The body count had spoken. The math said the Americans were winning. General Vo Nguyen Giap looked at the same numbers and saw something different. He was not a general who measured success by body count. He was a general who measured success by political will. His enemy's will to continue paying the price the war demanded. He had been at war in some form since the 1930s. He had fought the Japanese, he had fought the French, he had watched the French army collapse at Dien Bien Phu, not because it ran out of soldiers, but because the French people ran out of willingness to keep sending them. He understood that the United States, whatever its military capabilities, was a democracy, and that democracies eventually had to answer to their populations about whether a war was worth what it was costing. He was willing to accept enormous casualties. He had been accepting enormous casualties for his entire military career. The question was never whether North Vietnam could sustain losses. The question was whether the United States could sustain them politically over the years and years that a conflict of this kind required. Giap said plainly after the war that Ia Drang taught him how to fight the Americans, not how to defeat them in the field. He understood that American firepower made field victory against American units extremely costly, but how to manage the war at a strategic level, maintain pressure, accept tactical defeats, preserve the main force units, keep American casualties high enough, consistently enough, over enough years, that the political cost in Washington eventually exceeded the political will to continue. He later observed that the United States had no strategy to win. It had a strategy to not lose, and those were not the same thing. The distinction matters because it reveals the fundamental asymmetry of the war that the body count metric was designed to obscure. For the United States, the war was an intervention with a definable endpoint, a South Vietnamese government stable enough to survive without American military support. For North Vietnam, the war was a continuation of an independent struggle that had already outlasted the Japanese occupation and the French colonial army, and whose endpoint was not a stable situation but a complete one. Giap and Ho Chi Minh were not fighting to achieve a balance of power. They were fighting for total victory, and they had demonstrated across 2 decades that they were prepared to absorb whatever losses that required. The body count strategy assumed that the North Vietnamese decision-makers thought about casualties the way American decision-makers did. That assumption was wrong in every particular. The difference would take years to become fully visible. But Ia Drang was where both sides learned the lesson that would eventually end the war. The Americans learned it and ignored it. The North Vietnamese learned it and built their entire strategy around it. Moore knew this. He wrote about it later, in the book he co-authored with war correspondent Joseph Galloway, We Were Soldiers Once and Young, with a precision and an honesty that the official histories never achieved. He wrote that the most important lesson of Ia Drang was not the one Westmoreland drew from it. The most important lesson was that the North Vietnamese army was willing to fight and die in numbers and for a duration that the American system was not prepared to sustain, and that measuring the war in body counts was a way of seeing the battle while being blind to the war. Every number in Westmoreland's report was accurate. The conclusion drawn from those numbers was wrong. The consequences unfolded over the next several years with a terrible consistency. The search and destroy strategy continued. The body counts accumulated. American casualties mounted. The crossover point was never reached because it did not exist. The North Vietnamese replaced their losses, absorbed their defeats, and kept fighting. The American public watched the casualty figures rise with no corresponding evidence that the war was being won, and the political calculus that Jie had been counting on began to shift. By 1968, after the Tet Offensive demonstrated that the enemy Westmoreland had been reporting as nearly destroyed was capable of simultaneous attacks on more than 100 cities and military installations across South Vietnam, the strategy's failure was undeniable. Westmoreland was relieved. The war continued for 7 more years. 58,220 American names are on the wall in Washington. Moore went on to a distinguished career. He was promoted to general officer rank and eventually retired as a lieutenant general. He received the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions at Ia Drang, the Army's second highest decoration for valor. He remained for the rest of his life the kind of officer he had been on November 14, 1965. Direct, honest about what he had seen, unwilling to sanitize the record to make institutions look better than they were. He attended the funerals of his men for decades. He wrote to the families. He maintained the relationships that the promise at Fort Benning had created, because that promise was not a rhetorical device. It was a commitment he understood as binding for the rest of his life. He also refused, consistently and publicly, to allow the Battle of Ia Drang to be absorbed into the mythology of Vietnam as simply a tragedy or a defeat. It was neither. His men fought with extraordinary skill and courage against a well-prepared enemy that outnumbered them substantially, and they held their ground, accomplished their mission, and brought their dead home. The failure was not in the valley. The failure was in the offices where men read the numbers from the valley and used them to justify a strategy that the numbers could not support. Moore understood the difference. He spent the rest of his life making sure that distinction was part of the record. The order from Westmoreland that Moore refused is a single moment in a long story, but it illuminates something important about the way the Vietnam War was managed. The commanding general of American forces, looking at an active battle in which his men were fighting for their lives, decided that his most urgent priority was to have the battalion commander leave and come to Saigon for a briefing. The bureaucratic machinery of the war, the briefings, the reports, the metrics, the staff processes that fed Washington the numbers it used to make decisions, was so fully institutionalized that it took priority over the actual fighting. Moore was more useful to Westmoreland's staff as a source of data than he was to his battalion as a commander. That was what the order communicated, and Moore's refusal communicated the inverse, that 450 men who had been promised they would not be abandoned were worth more than the general's briefing schedule. Westmoreland never disciplined Moore for the refusal. The battle's outcome made that impossible, but the moment reveals the fault line that ran through the entire American war effort in Vietnam. The gap between the men doing the fighting and the system processing the fighting into information, between the reality of X-ray and the kill ratios in the briefing slides, between what the war actually was and what the strategy needed it to be. Hal Moore died on February 10, 2017. He was 94 years old. He had been married to his wife Julia for 55 years before her death in 2004, and he never entirely recovered from losing her. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. The men of the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, held a ceremony at his grave that none of them were required to attend, and all of them came to anyway. Some had driven across the country. Some had flown from overseas. They came because the promise he made at Fort Benning in 1965 was not the kind of promise that expires when the fighting stops. It was a lifetime commitment, and Moore had honored it for every one of the 50 years between Ia Drang and the end of his life. His boots were the first on the ground at Landing Zone X-ray on November 14, 1965. He kept every part of the promise he made. He stayed until it was over. He brought them home, and when the commanding general of American forces in Vietnam ordered him to leave before it was done, he sent his regrets, stayed on the ground, and let the order be what it was: wrong. The numbers from Ia Drang told Westmoreland the strategy was working. Moore knew the numbers were true and the conclusion was false. The difference between those two positions, between accurate data and correct understanding, cost 58,000 American lives and the war. The wall in Washington does not record kill ratios. It records names.